nightmare.
Hello and welcome to Cinema Subculture, where we discuss everything strange, obscure, and downright messed up in the world of movies. My name's Gary.
And I'm Simon. Today we are discussing 1979's Phantasm, directed by Don Coscarelli. Do you have one of the wee synopsis for this film, Gary?
Phantasm follows a young boy named Mike, whom, in the aftermath of his parents' death, discovers some strange goings on at a local mausoleum.
Strange indeed.
Particularly the character, the tall man.
Oh, yep. He is quite tall, isn't he? You haven't seen any of the sequels, have you?
I haven't.
No. Yeah, they're quite trippy. It's quite an unusual film, I think, for that period. It's got almost like it feels like an Italian influence. Like when I was watching it again this last time, I really did feel there's a lot of shots and the way that it's cut certain times. It did make me think of like Fulci and things like that. Like City of the Living Dead and the Beyond. There was something. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it just felt like almost like European in origin, which it was American made film. It's not. But what did you think of the film?
Yeah, so it's interesting that we went to this movie compared to The Burning, the last episode we talked about, because I had said on the Burning episode that that was a movie that was 100% genre and it was kind of lacking in a tourist flair. Whereas this film is almost the complete opposite. It's kind of overflowing with ideas, innovation, uniqueness, and a personal vision. I think it's full of iconic moments, but I think possibly, well, in a lot of ways, that's the strength of the movie. It's maybe also one of its limitations. Yeah, it's a film that's so full of ideas, it maybe kind of falls over its own feet in a way.
It's interesting to see it like iconic moments, and because I think one of the mantras that the director had for this was he said he'd seen a lot of horror film trailers, and they have this kind of tension building in these trailers, and kind of almost this kind of high intensity. But then when you'd see the film, it was like maybe like a tiny little bit of that, probably what you saw in the trailer, and then the rest of the film was usually not quite as intense or scary. So he made it his business. He kind of he said to himself, if he ever made a horror film, he wanted to have like a scare every so many minutes. I think it's 9 minutes. There's something happens, something iconic, there's something like either a shot or the over the bed shot, the seeing the little, well, I'm going to call them Jawas, but they're the little dwarf characters and stuff like that. There's definitely, and even the opening is like a kind of iconic scene that's that you can kind of pull that out of the film, and anyone who's seen Phantasm probably it becomes this iconic thing, the Lady in Lavender. So I wonder if that's maybe born from that, this kind of you're saying tripping over its own feet and kind of getting on in its own way with these iconic shots. It's almost like a series of short films almost, of these trying to short film, they say it should have a punchline. It's almost like every 9 minutes they've got this punchline of this short film, and I wonder if that feeds into what you're saying.
Yeah, possibly. Because it is a rarity in a sense. Like horror, maybe of all the genres, is one that relies on convention and maybe laziness in a sense. When you get into a second tier independent horror, it's just churn about the churn in a sense. A lot of the movies we talk about the slasher cycle and the Italian exploitation rip-off cycle, whereas this stands on its own as a unique vision. I think Coscarelli had said that a lot of the ideas from the film, particularly the balls, came from a dream he had. You don't get much more personal than that,
Yeah.
like coming from right inside. But yeah, so I think it should be credited. It's a film overflowing with confidence. It's got a unique ability to create a strange mood. It's extremely dreamlike, extremely well made. Surprisingly, for like an independent shoot, you wouldn't really get that. I don't think there's any no sense of that. Maybe only some of the acting is a wee bit maybe non-pro in places. But I think it's quite a remarkable piece of work.
so apparently, like Coscarelli would hire the kit, the camera equipment. He would hire it all. He would hire it like on a Friday morning or a Friday, and then he would return it on a Monday. Effectively meaning he only had to pay for like a single day of hire. So he would film everything over a weekend. So like, coming back to that kind of like short film feeling it and kind of trying to make the most of what you're shooting so that everything is, again, coming back to like iconic or kind of striking in a way. And it kind of leads up to this kind of weird kind of jigsaw of a film that, I mean, I wonder if that is why it is a little bit weirder. But then it's the dream thing as well, isn't it? It's, those, it almost feels like a dream, the film itself. And I mean, spoilers, but it's like a series of dreams that he's having throughout the film. And that kind of almost, you could kind of almost explain that as a choice by the director to put it together like that, if you know what I mean. But I'm not sure if it's I'm not sure which is resulted from which, whether it's the way the film was made and the intention of it, or an intention of having these scares or these moments so to keep the intensity up, or if that was the intention, if it was the intention to have it feel like a bunch of dreams. I'm not sure.
My favourite part is probably the first 20 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is kind of like a little movie on its own, where you do get a real sense of space, and I think you get the isolation of Mike's character. Mike's the younger brother. And Coscarelli also does a really interesting thing in this section that I don't think he really does later in the movie, but it's something that stood out to me as really nice. He'll have like dialogue, but then he'll cut to a separate image. You might have like a conversation going on, but he'll cut to a separate image, but it's not clear, is that happening in the past, the future, is it even happening at all, is it a dream? He does that multiple times in that first section, and that really gives a real nice sense of atmosphere and strangeness to the movie. Which I love that. I love that section. Just a lot of shots of like Mike on his own, just kind of wandering about, kind of mysterious things happening to him. But yeah, I think as the film progresses, it does get kind of bogged down in kind of character and plot points. Unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I can remember one specific time when he does that later on when Mike's in the car with the two girls and they get attacked and he gets like boosted out the back window and he's lying in the road and there's shots to Jodie, his brother, and again it's like you're not really sure what the relevance is of what you're seeing, but you're right, it does kind of become a little bit more like chronological, or like a bit more not by the numbers, but the formula gets in place and suddenly okay, things are getting, things gather, suddenly everyone knows what's going on and then they're going out to get the bad
Yeah, it
guy.
becomes a bit more linear.
Yes, that's it. Yeah, that's it exactly.
Mm.
But I think you're right. I mean, it's like I think there's the scenes in the graveyard at the beginning, when Mike's on his bike, and then it cuts to him going to see. I think it just cuts to him going to see the fortune teller. And that scene really felt like almost like the Beyond or something, to me, like that, and then he says about like something that he say something terribly that he did, and then it cuts back to the graveyard and he's like flipping his bike, and and it's it's very much that like non-linear structure.
Yeah, so one of the prevailing kind of ideas of the film seems to be, in terms of criticism, seems to be that it is very innovative, but it's a bit incoherent, a bit of a mess. Do you agree with that
Yeah,
as well?
definitely. I mean, again, I watched all these films kind of one after the other. The second one was quite a big budget in comparison, and then the third and fourth and onwards they kind of went down again and became more indie. So the second one's probably the most kind of conventional, even though it has elements of from this film, obviously. But the first one was felt like very much like an outlier, and the kind of weirdness of it, and the kind of you're not really sure what's meant to have happened by the end, because and the sequels don't make it any better because they reference things that seem to have happened in the dream world in the first one. as having happened. Like for some reason, like Reggie can remember being stabbed, even though that seems
Right,
to
right,
be,
okay.
and kind of picks up in the second one as if that was a dream. So it's, there's weird kind of multi alternative reality stuff going on later on, which brings to another point. I mean, this is a kind of mixed genre film, really. It's horror until it's sci-fi horror,
Mm.
which I don't think I was expecting.
I also read one of the motivations that Coscarelli had was he constantly wanted to mash up genres, as you were saying there about the sci-fi and the horror, um, and sort of, I think the idea was to keep people guessing, not sure exactly where the film is going. Um, but he does have this thing going through it where he seems to, at every plot point, want to do a handbrake turn, U-turn, to constantly. They think it's kind of going one way, then he'll just throw in like something crazy. Um, one of the kind of points where I was like maybe a bit too far was the finger. When Mike cuts off the tall man's finger,
Yeah.
and the finger thing is amazing.
Yes.
The yellow blood puts the finger in the box, incredible stuff. But then he has to go and take it further when it turns into like a crazy rubber fly type deal. Um, and it just seems like it's a finger that's still alive, but not some crazier has to happen. It has to turn into a fly. Um, yeah, I thought stuff like that was maybe Cosgrave wanting to keep the audience um, on the edge of its seat, not
Mhm.
knowing, unable to predict the future. But maybe that strategy was just downside of that strategy is you're constantly you can't settle into anything.
Mhm.
I think maybe if the film had sort of settled down and sort of pushed some of its thematic content um, a bit further to the front rather than the plot twists, it might have been a bit more successful because it's got that stuff in there that's really good. Like, you know, I think sort of about Mike's fear of death, since the death of his parents, etc. Mike's isolation, his fear that his brother's going to leave
Mhm.
again. So that stuff's in there, which is really good. But I think, yeah, that's more in the start of the movie. Then as the film progresses, it seems like all these little plot twists kind of take us away
Mhm.
from like leaning back into that thematic content a bit more.
It's interesting that you're saying that. I'm kind of picking up from you again. I'm referencing the sequels a lot here, and there's a kind of a reason for that. One of the things that Coscarelli mentioned was that there's a lot of ambiguity obviously in this film. The tall man walks past the ice cream van, and the cold air's hitting him, and it's kind of unclear, is that something he enjoys or is it something that's hurting him or what, right? And kind of the comment like was made like, well, maybe we'll find that out in another film, which is like, kind of ironic given that it was I think it was like 9 years between this and the second one. So it wasn't as if they were in a rush to get those answers there, and certainly I don't think there are definitive answers. But another thing that they kind of said over the series was that they wanted the tall man to like. So coming back to this film, I think it's a lack of rules. Maybe there aren't necessarily rules for what the powers are of this tall man. I think that was one of the things they set out to have was there are no rules in the filmmaking. You can kind of do whatever they want him to do in a way that I guess what they're trying to make the justification is they want it to be scary and unexpected. But I think maybe what it does is it can feel a little bit. Well, in later films, I think it feels a little bit like we'll just get him to do whatever we need him to do. One of those, it's just to fit the plot. In this film, I think it was just to kind of try and surprise people and just keep, so that you don't know what he can do. He's not just like a monster mortician or someone who kills someone or a grave robber. Suddenly he's this alien or something. But yeah, I think the reason they kept the fly in the film was his mum made it. So
Right.
I think that was why he eventually, because he mentioned it, there was meant to be like this bit at the end of the film where Mike goes through like a kind of when the tall man's chasing him, he's meant to go through this kind of gauntlet of things that have happened throughout the film. Like the lady in lavender's there, he was meant to run into the fly at the web system and stuff like that. He said, but it looked like shit, so we ended up just cutting it.
Right.
So I think he maybe left it in just for his ma.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, I think it's maybe like a lack, almost like, you know, even though you can be ambiguous, I think, but I think that kind of, as you say, it was maybe just a level too far, you know. In this film, you know, if you had ideas for more, that was maybe like, as you say, a step too far in this film.
Mm. Yeah. I think the ambiguity of it is a strength in a sense when you're doing that kind of dreamlike thing. What's real, what's not. But it can be a sort of narrow board to walk, can't it? Where it's bordering on incoherence,
Mm-hmm.
or is it a sort of world where you think you don't understand it, but it kind of makes sense, like something that David Lynch does really
Yeah.
well. It is incomprehensible, but it kind of feels like there's a sort of system behind it. Uh, a bit sort of maybe other filmmakers when they're dealing in that type of a deal, it's just it smacks of a lack of. It's just everything thrown at the screen type of idea. So I think this film's somewhere between those two. The dreamlike quality is obviously one of the strengths of the movie. But I think I did read that they didn't really have a formal script. They were sort of developing the script on the fly. But I think it still holds up.
Just to come back to a few things you said there. It's interesting you bring up David Lynch, because I was going to make the point where you're saying about, you know, pushing things too far with the fly, you know, the monster, and you know, maybe the line is, in this case, you know, there's a lot of creepy things happening with the tall man, but for me, that even in this watch was one where when that happened, I kind of like burst out laughing a little bit, because it was like,
Mm,
Jesus, what next kind of thing was the feeling I
right.
had. But when you mentioned Lynch, you know, so I was wondering if that was maybe where the, you know, where that feeling of like, oh no, you've gone a wee step too far here. But when you talk about David Lynch, I get a similar feeling sometimes from his films, whereby something will happen or something can happen, whether it's intentionally funny or not. I think that the difference is you feel like he is having fun with it, and it's kind of
Mm,
intentionally, like he's probably laughing at that as well. Whereas with
mm,
this, you're not quite. I don't think you're sure whether it's just meant to be. Oh, look at now it's a monster fly. You know, maybe that's a distinction. But I kind of think they both kind of do the same thing. Where kind of Lynch can kind of push it a little bit further and further and further. But I think he kind of, as I say, gets the irony of what he's doing in some cases.
mm.
And pulls into it, and perhaps Coscarelli does as well. I mean, I've seen a few of his other films, Bubba Hotep, and what else have I seen? That might actually be the only one. I know he directed a film called John Dies at the End, which I've been wanting to see for a while. But and certainly he directed all but the very last Phantasm film. So I think there definitely is a kind of comedy nature to it, like almost like kind of a really weird Evil Dead kind of tone to the later sequels. So maybe it's something like that. But yeah, no, I think it definitely still holds up as well.
So one of the things about the ending is it turns out the whole narrative was a dream, or was it a
Yeah.
dream? Bit ambiguous here. So you're more familiar with the
Mm.
series than me. So is there a definitive answer to
I
that?
don't think so. Not a definitive answer. I would say that if there is a definitive answer, it's that there's alternate realities. Yeah. Um,
Right.
like almost all the main characters from this film, even the ones that die or are revealed to be dead at the end, are in later films in one way or another. In some cases, it's really them. In some cases, it's like not really them. You know, so it's kind of, and specifically the last one, which is definitely the weakest, I'd say. Directly deals with alternate realities, with like kind of skipping between things. So it's hard to say. I don't know what the intention is here. I
Right.
remember feeling a bit of a kick in the nuts when the first time I watched it, when when Reggie gets stabbed, and then
Mm.
I guess I wasn't really attached to Reggie, even though he becomes pretty much the main star in later films along with Mike. But the fact that then Jodie was dead, like I remember like finding, I was like, that's a weird decision. I don't know why, I wasn't quite sure why, because especially when you see the end and the tall man is there, you're like, so it did happen, and so it was kind of like, what was the point of it all being a dream other than just to let Reggie live? It almost felt like, whoops, we killed Reggie off. We probably want him to be alive now, so we're gonna just say it was a dream. But the tall man's still there though, so don't worry. We can definitely.
Right.
You know what I mean? It felt like an odd decision to have it as a just be a dream, but then have the tall man still there. I don't know. I guess it's hard to look at it without seeing the sequels in my mind. Because if I'm trying to think of this film, that's a tropey thing. You know, what I mean, I know that's a tropey thing. It's, the end of Nightmare on Elm Street. all these things that they try and kind of say everything's normal now. And then it's not necessarily. But yeah.
Yeah, because normally I'm not really a fan of that. At the end, pulling the dream card, because it usually feels quite disingenuous to the audience, especially like this, where the audience has really no clue that it's potentially a dream.
And also the fact that the way it's so subtly done, from that shot of the tall man in the hole with the rock on top, Mike turns around and then it just cuts to him in bed asleep. It's not like one of those like,
right,
I've woke up and it's a dream. So it could almost be the next morning. The gut punch comes when then he's in the front of the fire with Reggie, and you're like, what the hell is going on now? That's like, anyway, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah. Something like Wizard of Oz does that as well, but the fact that you have in Wizard of Oz, you have a realist world, then you have a surrealist world, it's an indicator that the audience can latch onto, so it's not such a gut punch. You don't feel cheated at the end necessarily, where I think superficially you should feel cheated here, but it doesn't really matter in the end, because everything that's going on through the film is strange enough that it doesn't really matter ultimately.
Yeah, I think that the kind of non-linear nature, certainly as you say, the earlier parts of the film kind of lean into this and make this not, in a weird way, not quite as jarring. If that makes sense. It's kind of like a weird, it kind of butts up against the rest of the film, but you're kind of all right with it. I don't think it necessarily does anything. And I think also the scene's quite nice with Reggie and Mike. It's quite a sincere scene, and I think it's probably certainly from Reggie, not that he's not in the film, he doesn't have big parts of dialogue or acting. I don't think in the rest of the film that aren't that are with other characters necessarily. But this feels quite heartfelt and probably one of the better performances, in my opinion, of the film. So I think that kind of softens it a little bit for you, because you're maybe in, or I was into that relationship at that moment. I mean, I was just going to say that it's funny because we looked recently at the Burning, and we made mention of the fact that it's like a final boy in that film, which is rare for a slasher film specifically. But in this film, again, it's not just a final boy; it's like three final boys almost. And then they kind of swap one at the end because the switcheroo with Jodie and Reggie. But I suppose obviously this isn't it's not a slasher film, even though it has some of those kind of tropes at times. But again, a little bit unusual around that time to have. I mean, there's almost no female characters in the film. There's certainly no main female characters, other than, the most main female character is the lady in lavender, who I don't think she says very much. I think she's maybe got a couple of lines. I think she moans somebody's name a couple of times. But I mean, she's technically the tall man. But that's unusual, I think.
It is quite unusual to have to not have like female characters sort of being exploited within horror, because you sort of think of that just kind of is part of the deal. I think Brian De Palma said something like, an audience just won't buy a man being chased by somebody with a knife. It's a paraphrase, but something to that effect. Unfortunately, women just work better as horror movie victims.
I guess it maybe still fits in some way to that innocence thing that they about women, that they try and like that, or vulnerability, because it is a kid that the whole man is chasing primarily. There's two technically grown men, grown ass men, that are there as well, but they're not really getting chased by the protagonist in such a way. But yeah, maybe that's the kind of payoff there, or the trade-off. Sorry. But yeah.
So Simon, what's your final thoughts on Phantasm?
Again, it's really hard for me to see this film outside of the series because it has become such an iconic film series. It's a huge fan following. I do consider myself a fan of the series. It's kind of one of those. It edges onto the so bad it's good with some of the sequels. But yeah, it kind of stands up next to like things like the Evil Dead series for me. You know, that kind of, as they get kind of comedy horror later on, and it's got that kind of thing where like sometimes the first film in a series can be like a little anemic and not rewatchable. You know, you kind of find that the sequels are where the fun happens. But I think this film's just as fun as the sequels and has that kind of innocence that, and kind of innocence I'd say, and kind of naivety that the other films don't have, because you know you don't have all this background or baggage with other films. With this film, sorry. So yeah, I'd give this a thumbs up.
Yeah, I'd say it's a really great movie. One of its strengths is its ability to create a really strange mood. It's got really inventive, iconic character design. It's overflowing with visual style and iconic moments. Does get bogged down in sort of its overabundance of crazy ideas, but ultimately it's a really strange moment in horror history.
Yeah.
So you've been listening to Cinema Subculture. If you'd like more of this content, make sure you've subscribed on YouTube, like the video and hit the notification bell.
Okay, well thanks for listening. I've been Simon.
I've been Gary.
Boy!
It was a nightmare.